Hi and welcome to this month's Platinum Webinars for Conan Fitness. We're going into stress recovery and state management, and we're going to apply it this time into both sport and also the workplace, because the real premise that we're looking at here is with whether it comes to sport or the workplace, the main concerns that we're always looking at, particularly with those things, is increased performance and decreased injury. So that's classic for sport. Increased performance, decreased injury. It's pretty obvious. Same with work. In the workplace, obviously we want to increase performance, and decreasing injury would be decreasing accidents, decreasing mistakes, basically decreasing downtimes. So that's the main premise we want to have in the back of the mind when we're looking at this topic, looking at stress, recovery, and state management. So specific topics, we're going to look at the significance of sleepiness and insufficient recovery, types of stress and some management strategies, state, so emotional, physiological and psychological state, and also some of the causes, risks and how we can deal with it. Firstly, let's get an idea of what we're talking about for fatigue, because we're looking at something that's different from weakness, because weakness you can't alleviate, whereas fatigue obviously can be alleviated from rest, big difference, and that there are different factors that affect fatigue or different means of getting to fatigue. One could be the central nervous system, so central nervous system fatigue, adrenal or adrenal gland fatigue, that's more chronic as you'll see later on, and some sort of physical exhaustion as a means of fatigue, which often comes down to energy or even just glucose. It could be a nutritional thing, but it might present mental fatigue, it might present muscular fatigue, these different types, and we want to keep all of them in mind when we look at these topics. So firstly, with rest and recovery, a key factor here are our sleep needs, so what are the requirements, and also the cycles of sleep. Understanding them as we've been into them before certainly helps. Understanding it helps us to implement strategies to optimize it. We're going to look at a sleepiness scale just to get an idea of whether we're getting enough sleep. The supercompensation curve, that tells us where in relation to our level of recovery, our training, our sport, or our work should take place. It tells us a lot of information. And obviously, we want to highlight the point that recovery isn't just not training, and it's not just sleep. So sleep is a part of recovery, but it's not just sleep. And not training doesn't mean you're recovering. So some people say, oh, I didn't train that day, so I'm recovering. And it's not necessarily that simple, because people can go to a workplace or not train wherever it is and be stressed and not eat right or not sleep right or have wrong emotions, and that their sympathetic nervous system is still going crazy as opposed to the parasympathetic nervous system. And it's just not conducive to recovery. So let's have a look at all of that with the sleep needs and cycles first. As you can see from this picture, at the top of the diagram, you see here, if this were our line for being awake, full wakefulness, throughout our sleep we dip into deeper and deeper levels of sleep, and you see we typically go through these stages, and each stages are marked by physiological differences and certain differences that happen in the mind. What we mainly want to look at is that in the top part, what they call REM sleep, that's actually your lighter levels of sleep, typically where you do most of your dreaming, and the deeper levels of sleep are where you're just fully out of it, are much harder to wake. And all of these stages are very important. So if you see the typical cycle for an average adult, this is an adult person's night, classic 8 hours, we're looking at 3 to 5 cycles that the average person would probably go through, and each one of these are about an hour and a half. Towards the early part of the sleep cycles, you see that it's predominantly focused around deep sleep, whereas towards the end there's a little bit more towards the shallow REM sleep. And we want all sleep happening in all stages, but the classic problems that come up is, let's say someone's interrupted regularly throughout the night. Maybe it's a newborn child, or maybe they're got some stress that's waking them up, or physiological things that are waking them up. Maybe pain in the night. then classically deep sleep is interrupted because it takes time to get into deep sleep, and if it's constantly bunked back up from being woken, then they're getting regular REM sleep, hopefully, but they're not getting into deep sleep. Vice versa, they might be getting deep sleep, but if the sleep isn't long, as in they're not getting a quantity of hours throughout the night, let's say they cut off here and they're only getting 4.5 hours, then during the period of deep sleep, they're probably getting enough of that, but they're lacking a little in the REM sleep, which is, the greater proportions of it typically happen later in the early hours of the morning, or late hours of the morning, I should say. So, sorry, just to go back on that, a really important thing to keep in mind is, when you see the movies of the interrogation specialists or the armed forces, they're interrogating someone, or maybe the enemy's got someone from the other party, and they're really trying to break them down to find out vital information that person holds. What is the number one interrogation tactic that they use to break someone down? And the classic example is the classic answer is sleep deprivation. So they use many tactics, they torture them, deceit and lies and all that. But when it comes to sleep deprivation, or when they want to have someone weak-willed, when they want them to lack motivation and lack patriotism to their country or their work, lack loyalty and lack care and concern for the team that they once risked their lives for, what do? Sleep deprivation. So it just goes to show how important sleep is and how we are not ourselves when we don't get enough or the right amount. This here is one of the popular sleepiness scales, which just gives a person an indication of how well slept they are. If you look up in this top right hand corner is just a little key showing that 0 to 3 is a score, and out of those 4 options it's either no chance of dozing, slight, moderate or high chance of dozing. And the idea is to apply these scores to each one of these sentences. So whether it's sitting and reading, what's the chance of dozing? Watching television, sitting inactive, as a passenger in a car, lying down to rest, sitting and talking to someone, etc. And the last one is in a car while stopped the lights for a few minutes. But it just gives someone an idea, and someone who's overtired would score quite high, like a high chance of dozing in many of those scenarios. Keep in mind, increasing performance and decreasing injury, sleep is a huge, huge factor. The next one was our super compensation curves, and this just tells us the process that the body goes through whenever it's encountering what we call a stress response or a training response. So if this line here were to indicate your normal level of, let's say, normal level of recovery or normal level of strength or fitness or ability, whatever you're measuring, and let's say at this point in time, down the bottom axis is time, and this axis is your recovery or your strength or fitness, whatever you're measuring. Where this stimulus is, you can see when someone goes through a training period or a stress response, or they've had a big day at work, they go through a fatigue, a period of fatigue, and that obviously takes us down into lower levels of strength. So people aren't stronger when they're when they're trained, they get weaker, right? So here you're going through this fatigue response, and this is where the training session or the stimulus has ended at this point in time. And once that happens, this fatigue stimulates a recovery response. So the average process would be that over a period of time, now how long that is we can't say, whether it's a period of hours, days or weeks, depends what it was, but they go through a process of recovery. That takes us up to the original line here, which says, so you're back to where you started as your original strength. But if you, and then ideally the body will keep progressing to higher levels of compensation, what we call supercompensation, and that's the very peak of the curve. And that's when you're in an even stronger or more super recovered state. That's when it's ideal to train again. If you then did nothing, you'd go through evolution and then restart it again. But in this scenario, when would be the perfect time to train again, or to revisit the stimulus that originally created the supercompensation? And the answer is at the very peak of that supercompensation curve. But what happens if we hit the next training session or the next stress response or the next stimulus on the body if it's below the pink line? What if it happens around here? Then you can see this will go through lower, and if that kept happening, then you'd be into classic overtraining, and that we see all too often. So the way to look at it is that no matter how you look at the body's response, any stressor placed on the body, whether it's immune or physical or emotional, it will result in a stress response that, depending on that person and their tolerance and their resilience, will inevitably cause at least a minor dip in energy reserves post-incident. And just like an athlete's weaker after a workout, during this period, the body is momentarily compromised, and it will be until it's fully recovered. It's definitely weaker, its energy reserves are lower, and immunity is less during the fatigue state. So short-term immunosuppression leaves the body more vulnerable to disease during that period. So here's why getting the right amount of recovery is absolutely essential. This picture here, if you can see a line right through the middle of that, let's use this example as being the steady state of your body as far as, let's say, recovery, or let's use the example of sleep. If the line were right on the point of wakefulness and everything above the line is more awake or more aroused, like high energy, and everything below the line would be sleep, then in this example, it's only just going below and just going above, probably a little bit like insomnia, like where when you're asleep, you're not really asleep, and when you're awake, it's not really awake, certainly not quality. That's a great example of an idea of what we don't necessarily want to do. Instead, we want to have a high undulating life because the body works in cycles. So when you're awake, you're well awake, and when you're asleep, you're well asleep. So it's being able to be on when you need to be on and be able to turn off and be off when you can. Now, this can be used for any scenario. It might be like, think about blood pressure. How do you get blood pressure down? And the idea is that by getting it up on a semi-regular basis helps to get it down, because someone who exercises and does resistance exercise and these sorts of things that put their blood pressure up momentarily means most of the time their blood pressure is low. Heart rate, you put heart rate up momentarily and that person gets fitter, and for the majority of the time their heart rate is low. It works with many physiological factors. When we want it to be we want it to work cyclical, because this undulating cycle is a healthy way for the body to be. What about the autonomic nervous system? When it comes to the nervous system, there's two autonomic divisions, which is what we call fight or flight, which most people know about. In this example, you see both the chicken and the tiger are both in sympathetic nervous system. That's what we call fight or flight. Obviously, the chicken's in flight; it's running away, and the tiger's in fight. But in this example, this is what we call the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. This is conducive to rest and recovery. So when we talk about training, we're obviously talking about this state, sympathetic. That's when there's adrenaline going through the body, breathing's up, heart rate's up, blood's in arms and legs, and you're ready to train, fight, flight, do whatever you need to. It's the same as being in a stress response. Maybe it's in the workplace and there are demands on you, or it's stressful, or you need to be on the ball. Then this is the division of the nervous system that will be predominating. But when we turn off, this is the parasympathetic, or that's where we want to be in order to rest. And this is why we say that when we don't train, that's not necessarily recovering, because it's possible to not train but be stressed, and that's over here. And it's possible to not train and have high demands, or a fast-paced work life, work life, and that's over here. That's sympathetic. So imagine constantly being sympathetic. The body waits till it's here before it can fully recover. And if it never gets there, then it never recovers. And that's how we get into classic overtraining. One of the things with productivity, on a side note, is that it's very much related to this, because what happens if this is ongoing, long term, the constant push to continually produce, whether that's training or work, but it slowly fatigues the person's ability to sustain that production because they get fatigued, or at least sustain production at that level. And that the consequential decrease in productivity causes them to push even harder and fire on all cylinders to try to maintain the original productivity. And then that gradual decrease in productivity per work hour, so every hour of work they do, they're accomplishing less. Well, that leads them to just put in more and longer hours to make up the shortfall, which obviously in turn leads to further burnout and perpetually spiraling into exponentially exerted effort of diminishing returns, really. So very, very pertinent factor. When it comes to stress, it's important to keep in mind that we're built for stress and we're built for these short bursts. Because if you look back at our ancestry, where this is probably a typical day, but both scenarios, or the scenarios here for both the animal and the humans, is that they're in fight or flight. And generally, a scenario like this would be over and done with in a period of minutes or hours, but not days. So once it's done, it's fully done. You're either, if it's fight or flight, you're either dead or you're alive, safe, or you're either safe or you're dead. So the stress response will be over, and that person can fully recover. So when it comes to adrenal fatigue, it's unlikely to happen in this scenario because while it might be high levels of adrenaline, it's over in a short period of time, and then the rest of the day or week, whatever it is, they're recovering and they can do it again next time. But if it's low levels of adrenal activity, like adrenaline, low levels of stress, but continual, then it never gets the chance to recover. Now that brings us to state management, because when it comes to state management, we're looking at three main things. Our overall state is kind of a factor of our physiology, our psychology, and emotion. So think of physiological state, emotional state, psychological state, and altogether that's your state. And generally these are all fairly conducive to each other. So a certain psychology will lead to a certain physiology. They'll work in conjunction. And a certain physiology will lead to a certain emotional state. They very much work very closely. It's almost one and the same thing. Now, our state affects pretty much everything. It affects how we communicate. You think about how you communicate in different states. It affects your decision making, how you make decisions, your perception. It affects behavior. It affects judgment, and it certainly affects productivity. So if state affects behavior and our behavior affects our results, then our main job is to manage our state. When we think about getting the best results, whether it's work or play, sport or career, it's about managing state. And stress, as an example, stress is a state. A great example. So if that were the case, what could we do if our main role is to manage our state? What can we do as far as physiology is concerned, as far as psychology and emotions? Like physiology being the way we move our body, how we breathe, how we hold our posture. Our psychology being what we focus on. And there's a lot of research that's gone into the differences between optimism and pessimism, as one example of psychology, and how that affects one's health and work results, how well they do the results at work. And it affects many areas of their life. And obviously emotions. Positive emotions can make us do amazing things, and negative emotions can just absolutely eat us, and take us down to ruin, which is obvious and everyone knows it. So the main thing to take away is that by managing our state, if we've got that ability, we can really make inroads in increasing performance and decreasing injury. So finally, to put some strategies into place, the first is prioritizing. Think of production versus production capability, as we've heard of before. So that's production is producing now, but production capability is being able to produce again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next week, and next year. So we're thinking about it from a long-term perspective. And if you don't look after yourself or your company or whatever it is, then you're not able to produce tomorrow and next week. Flow. That's this diagram here that we get from our good friend Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who came up with the psychology of optimal experience, what he calls flow. If you think of matching up challenge with skill for best effect, and being in this flow channel, obviously, if there's an activity that has really high levels of challenge, and your skill relative to that is here, then you're going to sit here somewhere, and it's going to be just stress, anxiety. If the skill is really high, but the challenge is low, then you're going to be in boredom. So we want to sit in this flow channel. Well, that's with work and play, so both leisure activities as well. Let's remember our undulating curve, so being on when you're on and being off when you can. Relaxing, stretching, breathing to keep our physiology healthy. Physical activity, obviously. Good nutrition, obvious example. And how to get a good night's sleep. Here's a few tips or examples of how to good night's sleep. Keep a regular circadian rhythm. So for people who are shift workers, this is tough. Definitely tough, but the body certainly prefers to get up at the same time and go down at the same time because it just likes cycles, hence the term circadian. That means Diane is day. It means it's a daily cycle. Get regular exercise. Try to minimize noise and light. The body doesn't like light when it's sleeping. Restrict consumption of caffeine and alcohol before bed. Don't smoke. To improve deep sleep, try to go uninterrupted in sleep. Again, it's hard if there are things preventing that, but do your best. And to improve the REM sleep, just try and sleep a little longer in the mornings. So to wrap all that up, also to measure that, I should say, for those that know our training diaries, we actually measure in sleep both quantity and quality. Here's an example. We would just measure the day. Sleep time, you can do this. It's quite an interesting exercise to do, to see the relationship between a few days of good sleep and how you feel after that versus a few days of bad sleep and how you feel after that, both quantity and quality. So this measures quantity, how many hours in this example here, and then you tick quality. So you can have a bit of a read there of what the examples would be. And it's just a good little system to track and measure for a short period, maybe a few weeks or months, just to get an idea of what your average sleep pattern is like. So that's us looking at stress, recovery, and state management, how important they are to both increasing performance and decreasing injury in both your sport or training and the workplace, so at work or home. Very, very pertinent factors. So if there are any questions, please send them through. We'd love to hear from you. Send them to info@conanfitness.com. And until next time, train hard, play smart, and bring out the warrior within.